Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala wa ba'd. Jamaatul Muslimin, respected viewers, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let us continue with our timeline leading up to An-Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. We stopped yesterday, 1920, the Nabi Musa riots, and I know I broke a little bit away from speaking about the timeline and just looking at the reason why the Arabs in general, both of course the majority Muslim and the Christian Arab population, why they were up in arms about Zionist immigration. Zionist immigration that had already started in the 1800s and really picked up from round about 1881, 1882, especially because of the Russian pogroms. What was happening in Russia is that the Tsar, after the assassination of Alexander II, Tsar Alexander II, and for a very unknown reason, well, of course, anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish sentiment, which is the preferred designation, because anti-Semitism, as we have already established, was coined by a man by the name of Moritz Steinschneiger. And Moritz Steinschneiger, he coined the term anti-Semitischer based on the works of a French philosopher, Ernest Renan. And Ernest Renan was truly an anti-Semite. He was against, or he thought of Semitic peoples and Semitic culture and Semitic languages as being inferior to Aryan peoples and Aryan culture and Aryan languages. So, Moritz Steinschneiger, he then coined this term in the 1860s, anti-Semitische, which literally refers to the discrimination against all Semitic peoples. So not just Jews, but Jews and Arabs and Assyrians, and of course you get Semitic peoples in Ethiopia, the Amharic people, the Ge'ez people, the Tigri people. You know, these are all Semites. Actual fact, if we go all the way back to Sam, we find that it even includes the Elamites, which are to be found in Persia. And it includes the Arameans, which are to be found in northern Mesopotamia. And it includes, of course, Ashuriyun, the Assyrians. And it includes Arphaxad. Arphaxad is one of the 5 sons of Sam, which is the ancestor of Ibrahim, who is the ancestor of both Ismail, who is the ancestor of the Arabized Arabs, and Ishaq, who is the ancestor of the Jews. So, anti-Semitism, we have to ask the question, for what meaning was it coined? It was coined as a sentiment that was against all Semitic peoples and not just against Jews. And today, now that they've conflated anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, now it's lost its meaning totally. And so, if I'm to speak about the anti-Semitism that was taking place, in inverted commas, the anti-Semitism that was taking place in Europe, especially in the 19th century, and it wasn't just in the 19th century, we acknowledge that the Jews, after being exiled in the great diaspora of when Hadrian deported them from Judea, some settled by the Rhine, by cities like Worms, Mainz, and Speyer. That's where the Ashkenazim come from, because that piece of land was called Ashkenaz. And of course, there were those that were sent to Spain, and that is where the Sephardim Ashkenazim, Sephardim. Sephardim comes from the word Sepharda, which is the Hebrew word for Spain. So they basically have taken the name of the place to which they were deported. Sepharda, Spain, Ashkenaz, along the Rhine. And ever since then, I mean, you can actually go on the internet and you can Google how many times Jews were actually kicked out of lands. They were ethnically cleansed. How many occasions they were massacred. The first victims of the crusade, not the crusade of Peter the Hermit, but the first crusade that was led by the Knights of Europe, especially the French. And we see that their first victims were actually the Jews. They massacred the Jews. And when they got to Jerusalem, they burnt them alive. They burnt them alive in their synagogue. So this anti-Jewish sentiment was incredibly strong in Europe. From the time that they were deported in the middle of the 2nd century, roundabout, actually speaking about 134 of the Common Era, is when the great diaspora took place. There was already a great massacre that took place in the Holy Land. That was after the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa by Titus, the son of Vespasian, in the year 70. And the spoils of that war, or that genocide, we could say, that was committed by the Romans, we can see it on full display in Rome today, the Colosseum. The Colosseum was built with the spoils of that so-called Roman Jewish war that took place in the year 70, when Jerusalem and Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa were burnt to the ground. And then, but it culminated into the Bar Kokhba revolt, Simeon Bar Kokhba, when the Jews again revolted against the Romans. They took Jerusalem back, and the Roman legion came, many thousands of soldiers, led by Titus, the son of Vespasian, and they put down the revolt of Simeon Bar Kokhba, and forgive me, Titus was in the year 70. It was Hadrian in the one that put down the Bar Kokhba revolt in 134, and then the subsequent exile and deportation of all Jews from the land of, which was called then, that province was called the Judean province. And they renamed it Syria Palestina. The Byzantines divided it up into 3 provinces: Palestina Prima, Palestina Secunda, and Palestina Solitaris. So the land geographically has been called Palestine for more than 2,000 years. So people mustn't ask the question or make the statement there's no such thing as Palestine or no such thing as Palestinians. The whole idea of the nation state was only born in the late 18th, early 19th century. And there's more than 100 odd countries that were formed into nation states, even after the First World War. And after the Second World War as well. New nation states came into being from the old empires that were carved up. So geographically, that is why this program is called Palestine, the Holy Land. Because geographically, it's called Palestine. It has been called Palestine for the last 2,000 years. From a religious perspective, I'll call it Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. It's the Holy Land. But geographically, it is Ardu Palestine. Sayyidina Umar, when the Muslims conquered the Holy Land in the 7th century, they said, no, Umar, he referred to it as Jundu Palestine. That part of the Muslim army was camped in the land of Palestine. If we look at Mamluk maps, we see Ardu Palestine. If we look at Ottoman maps, it's written there, Palestine. You can look it up. So geographically it is the land of Palestine. So the anti-Jewish sentiment, which at the time would have fallen in the category of anti-Semitism, as coined by Moritz Steinschneider in the 1860s, was rife in Europe, and especially after the death of Alexander II, when they wrongfully and oppressively, any excuse to blame the Jews. That is exactly how it used to happen. Anything that went wrong, they would blame the Jews. Some child was killed. We spoke about blood libel. Those were real blood libels. Not when the Zionist state is accused of genocide, they want to say it's blood libel. No, the real blood libels were when innocent Jewish communities living in Europe, when a child was murdered, or some innocent person in the community of those Christian lands was killed, they would look for any excuse to blame the Jews, so that, number one, that they could pillage the wealth of the Jews, and then pogroms would ensue where the Jews were ethnically cleansed. That's why so many Jews up till today are saying, how could we do to the Palestinians? How is it possible that we as a people who were ethnically cleansed so many times, that were massacred on so many occasions, how can we do the same to another people? Meaning the Palestinians. So, because of that anti-Jewish sentiment, there were pogroms, and this accelerated after the assassination of Alexander II, and they started acquiring land in Palestine. Already at that time, the Arabs, they appealed to the Porte, meaning the Ottoman government, to restrict this Jewish immigration, because they could see where this was leading to. I spoke about Diyaddin Khalidi, who wrote to Herzl, saying that, as a Muslim, he does not in any way deny the connection of the Jewish people to the land. But this is something that, is part of history. They had their time there. And even according to Orthodox Rabbinical Judaism, God is the one that took them out of the land. God is the one that put them in the land. They broke the covenant. They were exiled. They repented. They were given another chance. They committed iniquities again. They broke the covenant again, and they were given their final eviction. So there is a connection, but a historical connection. And other people have been living there for 2,000 years. And so very early on in the history of the Zionist movement, you had Arabs appealing to the Ottomans to restrict immigration. You had Palestinian Arabs appealing to the leadership of the World Zionist Organization to cease, to put a stop to this idea and this project. But it fell on deaf ears, as we've so many times gone through that statement of Arthur Balfour, that Zionism, be it right or wrong, be it good or bad, that it's far more important than the desires of 700,000 Arabs. So they didn't think enough of the Arabs to consider their wishes or their requests or their pleas to not light the fire that we are seeing raging right now in the Holy Land. They lit the fire, but they were warned that if they light it, it's going to burn. And it's going to cause a lot of chaos and death and destruction. So, when the Balfour Declaration is issued in 1917, it's not like the Arabs were unaware of the Zionist movement. No, they were very aware of the Zionist movement. But because the Zionists were just a few percent, I mean, in 1917, they didn't even amount to 10%. So because there was such a small part of the population, and the big evictions like the eviction of Marj ibn Amir, the Jezreel Valley, hadn't yet taken place, there hadn't been any rioting yet. So the Nabi Musa riots are basically a major turn where it's going from protests and pleas and writing to this one and writing to that one. The Arabs were constantly in dialogue. When the British occupied Palestine on the 11th of December 1917, immediately the Arabs started a process of dialogue. They knew of Woodrow Wilson in 1919, of his 14-point plan for the self-determination of peoples that now find themselves in empires that have been defeated and broken up. And it's their right to get self-determination, to form their own nation, a nation state, and to be inducted into the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. But the British, of course, speaking with not just a forked tongue, but making 3 different promises to 3 different entities, making a promise to the French in the Sykes-Picot, making a promise to Sharif Hussein in the McMahon Hussein correspondence, and making a promise to the Zionists vis-a-vis the Balfour Declaration. So, 1881, from 1881 to 1917, there is a huge jump in the Jewish population, in the acquisition of land, even though it was still small, comparatively speaking. And I've got some statistics on that we can have a look at, inshallah ta'ala. But they were well aware. And so, 1920, the Nabi Musa riots take place. And that brings upon the Palin Commission. So every time there's a riot, then there's a commission and investigation into why are the people rioting. And it was blamed on the Arab insecurities. They wanted the mass immigration to stop. They wanted the land sales to be banned, because they could see them. Their country was literally being pulled out from under their feet like a rug. And of course, the British, who did they employ to implement this declaration? No one but a Zionist himself, Herbert Samuel, the man who made the suggestion of a so-called national home for the Jews in his memorandum of 1915. So they accepted the idea, they granted the Balfour Declaration, and then they even got a Zionist to implement the Balfour Declaration. 1922 was when the British officially got the mandate. But it was reiterated that the Balfour Declaration would be implemented. You will see over the course of 30 years how the interpretation of that Jewish national home, how it changed. In the beginning, when you had people like Arthur Balfour, Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, ardent Zionists, that they were fully on board with the eventual establishment of a state. But as the British administration changed hands, and also after the First World War and the lead up to the Second World War, alliances also changed in terms, let's not say alliances, but interests. Interests changed. You know, that's why in 1939 we see the British doing an about turn. 1939 with the white paper. They said, okay, only 75,000 over the next 5 years, Jewish immigrants. And in 10 years, there will be an independent Palestinian state with a type of shared government. But that, of course, never came to be. So 1920, we have in April the Nabi Musa riots. Then we have the Palin Commission. The Palin Commission says, look, the problem is immigration and land sales. But nothing is done about it. And so in 1921, there are more riots in Jaffa. And these riots, of course, they spread. And then there's another commission, the Haycraft Commission. So remember 1919, we have the King Crane Commission. It says, abandon the Zionist project. It's going to be a disaster. Everybody ignored the King Crane Commission. After the Nabi Musa riots, the Palin Commission. Mass immigration and land sales, that's your problem. Needs to be restricted. Nothing came of that. And that wasn't even the recommendation. They were just acknowledging that this is the reason. They hadn't yet made, the British themselves hadn't yet made that recommendation. They just acknowledged that this is the reason. Then the Haycraft Commission, which investigated the Jaffa riots, again identified Arab hostility due to immigration fears. And of course, with that, associated with that was land sales. So then in 1922, Winston Churchill, he basically puts forward a white paper with the proposal of limiting immigration, but clarifying the Balfour Declaration intent. That basically saying that, or trying to quell the fears of the Arabs, that the Zionists are not going to take over the whole country. You know, and of course, that is exactly what they were planning to do. Then 24th of July 1922, that's the formalized British control of the Palestine mandate, the mandate for Palestine, formalized British control by the League of Nations, incorporating the Balfour Declaration. But again, nothing is really done. The gates of mass immigration are still flung wide open, and land sales are unrestricted. So this now leads up to the Palestinians were incredibly persevering, were incredibly patient. You actually wonder why there wasn't much more violence earlier on. And so 1929, there are the Western Wall riots, where a number of Arabs and Jews were killed on both sides. And that then brings about 1930 Shaw Commission. Let's go for our short break and we'll be back thereafter. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala ma ba'd. Once again, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So inshallah ta'ala, we shall continue with our timeline, 1929, with the Hayat al-Buraq, the Wall of the Buraq as we know it, the Western Wall as it is otherwise known. And this basically spread to Safed and to Khalil, to Habrun, to Hebron. And there were a number of Jews and Arabs killed on both sides. Then we have the Shaw Commission, that's 1930. 1929 with the big riots. 1930. So there's a period of between the Jaffa riots and the Hayat al-Barak riots, there's a period literally of 8 years. 8 years. The Jaffa riots were in May of 1921, and the Hayat al-Barak riots were August of 1929. Then in March of 1930, the Shaw Commission finds that it's again because of Arab resentment of mass immigration. And I mean, by now, so many Arabs have been evicted from their lands that had been farming for generations, for hundreds of years, if not longer. And they discovered, or they found, I mean, this is, I say they discovered or they found. They knew this all along what was going to happen, but they didn't care. They didn't care about what was going to happen to the Arabs, to the Palestinians. They didn't even consider them. So I'm speaking about especially those three British Zionist leaders: Arthur Balfour, Winston Churchill, and David Lloyd George. All self-confessed Zionists. So the Shaw Commission again finds that it's Arab resentment because of mass immigration and land sales. And of course, these were land sales, land that was being sold to absentee landlords, land that was being sold by absentee landlords. So it wasn't even the Palestinians that were selling land. There might be a few examples of Palestinians that sold small pockets of land, but the overwhelming majority, and especially after the edict, the fatwa was given regarding to Palestinians selling land, that the fatwa said that from an Islamic position it is totally haram, totally prohibited. And so there's a myth that the Palestinians sold Palestine, and that's not true. Even by 1948, the Zionists had only acquired just under 7%, about 6.6% of the land through these land sales, mostly with absentee landlords in Syria and Lebanon. So you have the Shaw Commission, which is in the investigation. Then you have the Hope-Simpson report, which then recommends immigration limits based on economic absorptive capacity. And on the 21st of October 1930, the Parsfield White Paper makes it official by restricting Jewish immigration and land purchases. But then the black letter comes, a Risalat al-Sawda. The black letter, which is issued by Ramsay MacDonald. There's two MacDonalds. There's the MacDonald letter, which is written by Ramsay MacDonald, who was the Prime Minister of the time. And then there's the MacDonald White Paper, which is 8 years later, but that's written by the Colonial Secretary, who is his son, Malcolm MacDonald. So Ramsay MacDonald and Malcolm MacDonald. On the 13th of February 1931, the black letter, the MacDonald letter, reverses the Parsfield White Paper under Zionist pressure. Chaim Weizmann actually went to the Prime Minister and complained, and the Prime Minister literally reversed the Parsfield White Paper and basically wrote a new paper, and before signing it, before finalizing it, actually got the approval of the Zionist leader before it was finalized. The Zionists had the final say. That is in 1931. And we say, no, it's only now today that the Zionists are so powerful. AIPAC in America, and the Conservative Friends of Israel, and the Labour Friends of Israel, and wherever else they are in Europe and in the world. Yes, they are much stronger today than what they were then, but they wielded a lot of power and influence. You often hear, no, this idea that they wielded power and influence is an anti-Semitic trope. This is a phrase that keeps getting regurgitated. Again, it has no meaning. Because if one person in 1815 from a family that was to become, in actual fact, Jacob Rothschild, who passed away recently, he bragged that it was through his family that the Zionist state of Israel was established. Through the money and his family being the benefactor and the sponsor of the initial settlements and the setting up of the institutions and etc. in the Zionist state. We find a person like Nathan Rothschild, obviously at that time, definitely he would be sympathetic towards proto-Zionism because his brother-in-law, or the man that was married to his wife's sister. So his wife was Hannah, and her sister was Judith, and Judith was married to who? To Moses Montefiore, the man who literally set up the first Zionist or proto-Zionist settlement, Mishkenot Sha'ananim, on the road from Jerusalem to Hebron. It is said that he acquired the piece of land from Ahmed Agha, who was the mutasallim. He was the tax collector for Muhammad Ali Pasha when he ruled over Palestine for that 10-year period, 1831 to 1841, plus minus. And Moses Montefiore who was a big philanthropist in the Holy Land, especially for the Jewish people. And why I say especially? Because we have to acknowledge that he didn't only spend on the Jewish communities, although that is where most of his philanthropic work was done to aid the destitute Jews in Jerusalem. And that's why Mishkenot Sha'ananim was the first so-called Jewish settlement or suburb outside the walls of Jerusalem. And he's considered to be a leading proto-Zionist. Before the advent of the coining of the word Zionism by Nathan Birnbaum in 1886 and the advent of political Zionism by Theodor Herzl in 1897 and the World Zionist Organization. So there's a clear connection. Moses Montefiore is married to Judith. I think she was a Cohen, Judith Cohen, the sister of Hannah Cohen, who was married to Nathan Mayer Rothschilds, the head of the English branch of the Rothschilds banking family. The man who made, they say, anything between 1 and 10 million pounds off the Battle of Waterloo, which at that time was an enormous, I mean, in today's money, an enormous amount of money. He had mastered the art of the pigeon messaging system. Today we do it, with the cell phone. In those days they did it with a pigeon, tying a little letter to the foot of the pigeon, homing pigeons. And with the Battle of Waterloo, there was a rumor that the British were losing. Meanwhile, Nathan Mayer Rothschild was receiving information that the British had actually won. And so he also encouraged this panic sell-off of the British war bonds that had been purchased. And in the meantime, he had his agents buying up these war bonds, as they were being sold off, and he made an absolute fortune. And even in 1815, the so-called allies, the European allies that allied against Napoleon, they acknowledged that without the money of the Rothschilds, they would never have been able to beat Napoleon. So already in 1815, you had these Jewish families, proto-Zionist, not Zionist in our understanding of today, but the beginnings, the seeds of the whole idea, and became the biggest Zionists in terms of their philanthropic work and the aiding and abetting of setting up these agricultural settlements, like Edwin de Rothschild from the French branch of the Rothschilds banking family. And so the idea of Jewish power is not a myth. It's not an anti-Semitic trope. You know, but that is why I mean, nothing compared to today. I mean, here today they openly admit it. The Zionists openly speak about it. That they are in control of the media, in control of they have this one in AI, and they have this one in this industry, and this one in that industry. And how they must use this power and this influence to change public opinion about the Zionist state. They openly said it. I was watching a clip a few weeks ago. The Zionist was saying we must use this so-called Jewish power. You know, he's referring to Zionists. I don't like to say Jewish power because it's Zionist power, and I don't conflate Judaism with Zionism. But this is the words that they are using. And so the idea of Jewish power, though it was nothing, or Zionist power, then it was proto-Zionist power, is nothing like the Zionist power of today. They still wielded a lot of influence. So 100 years later, let's say 1915, 1916, 1917, okay, so 1815, without Rothschild's money, the Allies would have lost against Napoleon. That is acknowledged by the Allies. And he becomes even more powerful, probably the richest family in the world, the Rothschilds family at that time, the richest family in the world. And 100 years later, we have Herbert Samuel telling the British that if they can win the favor of the, in inverted commas, the Jewish people, he's referring to the Zionist Jews, if they can win the favor, the Bolsheviks in Russia, there were many so-called Jews, communist Jews, involved in the Bolshevik Revolution, and the Zionist Jews in America, to get the Americans to come into the war. So it was the Zionists themselves. I know there's even been books that have, it's called The Zionist Masquerade. The Zionist Masquerade. So the author of that book, my mind fails me in remembering. Let me just find it here, and then you can know what I'm speaking about. The Zionist Masquerade. His name is James Renton. James Renton wrote a book called The Zionist Masquerade, where he says that the Zionists basically fooled the British into thinking that they wield some international power and influence. Certainly not like what they wield today, but definitely they did wield. Maybe they exaggerated it, and they succeeded in fooling the British into thinking that their power and influence was greater than what it actually was. I don't deny that. I give it to them. I give it to them. But they still had influence. The Zionists still had great influence. Old Judge Brandeis, Louis Brandeis, he was made a Chief Justice by Woodrow Wilson. And he was an ardent Zionist. And there was many others that put pressure. Even Truman himself, who was the President of the United States at the end of the Second World War, he actually complains about the Zionist pressure that was put on him. I mean, that is in the 1940s, 1945, it's 80 years ago. So it's not a myth to say that there was a degree of so-called Zionist, whether it be proto-Zionist or our understanding from the birth of political Zionism in 1897, real Zionist power and influence in the world. If we can take 1815 as a mark of so-called proto-Zionist power and influence, and then look again in 1915, how it had grown and spread, and now we look 2015, 2025, how much power it wields and influence it wields today. James Renton, the Zionist Masquerade, that is the book. So let us go back to our timeline. So here we have, I mean, it can't just be one man. Some people say that, you know, this was the level of his charisma. And he was the one that, along with the other Zionists, that managed to fool the British and the Western powers. But I mean, the British at the time were still ruling, you know, most of the world. The empire on which the sun didn't set. So they couldn't have been fooled to that degree. They must have recognized some truth in what Chaim Weizmann was telling them. And as a result, Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of the British Cabinet, of Great Britain, of the British Empire, Ramsay MacDonald issued what the Arabs call the Black Letter, where he reversed the Parsfield White Paper's recommendations of restricting Jewish immigration and land sales. So of course there's going to be more riots now. Because, I mean, this is now, if we take the first riot, Nabi Musa riots, 1920, Jaffa riots, 1921, Hayat al-Buraq, and the Western Wall riots, 1929, and still nothing is being done. These recommendations have, it took 10 years to make recommendations, for those recommendations to immediately be overturned and reversed. So 1933, there's more anti-immigration riots, Jaffa and nationwide. And in December of that year, November, December of that year, there's another investigation. I mean, do they really need to do another investigation? How many investigations do we have so far? We have the King Crane Commission, which was investigating the sentiment of the Arabs in the region. That was ignored. We have the Palin Commission. Nothing really came of that. We have the Haycraft Commission, again just identifying the obvious. We have the Shaw Commission. We have the Hope Simpson Report. We have the Parsfield White Paper. We have the MacDonald Black Letter. And so when there's more riots, I mean, why not just immediately say, hey guys, look, we need to stop immigration. We need to stop land sales. We need to listen to these concerns of the overwhelming majority of the Arab population. I mean, by 1948, the Zionists are only, or the Jewish population, could be Zionist and non-Zionist, or Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, only amounted to about a third, about 33%, they say, by 1948. So the Arabs are still the overwhelming majority. And they were far less. They were far less in 1933. Inshallah, we'll look at some charts of demographics, inshallah, in the near future, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Something I'd like to go through. Actually look at a timeline of the demographics. So 1933, anti-immigration riots, that was in October. November, December, the Murison Commission. And that Murison Commission had a minor impact. Then 1935, because now Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam comes from Syria. Now the Arabs are tired now. This is 1930, this is 15 years later, and nobody's listening to them. So nothing left for them to do except armed resistance. Armed resistance. Which is English for what? For jihad. I don't know why English people refer to, you know, jihad, 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 when they believe themselves. I mean, we spoke about the harrowing of the North. You know what William the Conqueror did to the people of Northern England when they stood up in armed resistance. I mean, if we were speaking Arabic, we would have called that jihad. The jihad of the people of the north against William the Conqueror. So Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, he basically forms a small group, and they start an armed resistance campaign against the British occupation. And he is killed on the 20th November 1935. He's martyred. And then 1936, the Arab Revolt begins. I think that was like the spark, the martyrdom of Izzuddin al-Qassam. There was many other factors, of course. I mean, 15 years of not being listened to, 15 years of being ignored, mass immigration still happening, land sales unrestricted. So when Sheikh Izzuddin al-Qassam, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he is martyred in 1935, then the Arab Revolt begins, April 1936. And again, in the beginning it was just a general strike and uprising. And they form, in April of 36, they form the AHC, which is the Arab Higher Committee, which coordinated the Arab Revolt activities. And October 1936, in fact, the Arab states, very sadly, they appeal to the Palestinians to suspend the strike because it's probably hurting the economy. Instead of appealing to the British to give in to the demands of the overwhelming majority indigenous population of the land. And then, of course, 1937, what do we have? Another commission. Another commission. And this is the Peel Commission, which is the one who was responsible for it was Lord Peel. And this was the first recommendation for partition, which, although there was difference of opinion amongst the Zionists, some rejected it outright because they wanted the whole land, but others, they said, look, like Ben Gurion wrote to his son Amos saying, listen, this is a step. This is a stepping stone in us taking over the whole land, the whole of Palestine. He said it. It is documented. So they only accepted it on those grounds, that this was a foot in the door. A foot in the door. And at the same time, they had already established that whatever land that they were going to be granted, the 20% that they were going to be granted, that they would ethnically cleanse that land of Palestinians. And that's why the Arabs rejected it, of course. Those Palestinians had been in that land, and that some of the most fertile parts of the land had been there for generations, for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. And that's why the Arabs rejected the Peel Commission. And so, of course, the revolt, there was during the Peel Commission, which interviewed many people from the Zionist side, from the British side, from we even looked at the secret interview that was done with David Lloyd George, who as a Zionist was against partition because he wanted the land to stay as one and to be ruled by a Zionist majority at the end of the day. That was David Lloyd George. So the Peel Commission recommends partition. Then there's the assassination of a British official in the Galilee. It restarts the violent phase of the Arab Revolt. In September, Britain outlaws the Arab High Committee. The AHC is banned, and Mufti Amin al-Husseini, he flees to Lebanon. And in August of 37, the Zionist Congress had officially rejected the Peel partition specifics, but accepted the partition in principle. Why? Because they saw it as a stepping stone to taking over the whole land. That's all we have time for today. And we will continue tomorrow bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. I leave you all in the protection of Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.